Good day. Thank you very much. My name is Tawanda. I'll be presenting my talk titled The Impact of Racial Inequalities on African Development. I'll be sharing my screen now. So there is the title of my talk. I'm a Development Economics Fellow at the Office of Astronomy for Development, as well as a Research Fellow at Stellenbosch University. So this is a very famous picture showing on the left a well-to-do neighborhood, complete with swimming pools and everything. On the right-hand side, you can see a slum, a shanty town, epitomizing the racial inequalities in Africa. So this is a photo from South Africa, but you can see the same phenomenon across the entire continent. So this is a famous photo because it just summarizes some of the issues that we are struggling with respect to racial inequality. So this is inequality with respect to housing access that is being shown here. So my background is from a development economics point of view. So my talk, I've packaged it, from a development point of view. So the topic of economic exclusion of Black people is important, and it is relevant to the theme of this session because when a person is economically excluded, it limits their options, including access to good education, which will determine whether or not they will enroll into good careers, whether they will enroll into STEM careers, which are important for development, including astronomy itself. So there are a number of factors why there is economic exclusion of Black people in Africa. The first one is the legacy of colonialism. After colonialism, we still have post-colonial issues. There is access to services. There's a problem in access to service, also partly due to the legacy of colonialism. There are institutional factors that promote exclusion, as well as some cultural factors, as I'll be discussing later on in the presentation. So talking about the legacy of colonialism, this is because colonialism was fundamentally about the exclusion of Black people. The end of colonialism locally was the death knell to racial inequality. Yet on the global scale, the superiority of the West over Africa, for example, didn't change one bit. So at the same time, we've seen some impressive progress post the colonial era here in Africa. It's not all lost. So we have post-colonial issues in terms of racial inequalities in accessing the land, in accessing good quality education, in accessing healthcare, among many other issues. In terms of access to services, you find that there is lesser transport infrastructure in African areas, which is a legacy of colonialism. There's also fewer schools as well. I've already, made mention of institutional factors that promote exclusion, as well as cultural factors. So this map here shows Rhodesia, which is now present-day Zimbabwe. It was called Southern Rhodesia at some point before it reverted back to Rhodesia until 1980, which was the attainment of self-rule by Zimbabwe. So this picture is important because it also epitomizes the sort of status quo across many other African states, whereby there was land segregation across access to resources, across access to the land, access to education, access to health, access to capital, among other aspects of access. So in these middle areas of the country, that's maybe light brown or light pink in the middle areas of the country. These areas were reserved for whites. So that's according to the Land Apportionment Act of 1930. So this picture was drawn when the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 was passed into legislation. So if you were a white person, you could, maybe let me phrase it this way: Blacks were not allowed to settle in these middle areas of the country. Then Blacks were only allowed to stay in these light reddish areas here. So these were called the tribal trust areas, where the land titles or the tenure security system was a customary tenure type of system, whereby the land access is governed by a traditional headman or chief, and land is collectively owned. You don't have title deeds to the land. If you look at these few patches of gray here, these were called the native purchase areas, where Black people could buy land and actually hold title. So these were a few areas which were designated under this act for Black people as well, well-to-do Blacks for that matter. But the rest of the country in the middle, these areas were reserved only for white people, right? So moving on to the next slide. So you find in these white areas, you had more, investments, substantially more investments in infrastructure and many, other developmental aspects. Whereas in the African areas, you had a scanty sort of, infrastructure system that could support agriculture and everything. So what you then see is that in the African areas, in these red areas or in these gray areas, but actually, this research was specific to these farmers in these gray areas. So these farmers in the gray areas, in the native purchase areas, where Blacks could buy land, had title deeds, like their counterparts here in the white areas. But the distinguishing factor was, number one, the quality of the land, but also access to transport networks. So they didn't have access to the market, even though they had land titles. So what this research I did in my PhD shows is that Black people with title deeds, if you were located within 1 kilometer of a main highway or a main road, you actually had more agricultural production. But if you were located, at a further location, maybe within 1,000 kilometers here, in the bottom here, you can actually see that you actually did disadvantage in terms of agricultural production. So this also transcends even in terms of, say, you want to send your child to school. If the area that you are in doesn't have a good transport or good road or rail network, then it's very difficult for you to send your child to school. So that then resulted or influenced these racial differences in educational attainment that we see even today. This picture, I'm also focusing here on Zimbabwe because I've got more background on Zimbabwe because I come from Zimbabwe. So this picture shows the location of missionary schools. So this is their contemporary location, but that has always been their location. So these are mission schools. But you then find that when you look at the number of mission schools falling within European areas and the number of mission schools falling within African areas, as I show on the next table here, you see that so this was a mistake here. 44 is supposed to be on top and 51 below. So marginally, the African areas had more missionary schools than the European areas. So this data might not be very accurate, but it's a reflection of what was happening back then. But then when you look at, when you consider the population now, you then find that the population adjusted ratios show that European schools had a higher, levels of schools compared to African areas. So what then that means that the ability of Africans to send their children to school is limited as compared to relative to their white counterparts. So those differences have persisted even today in many African countries. So there's a big literature on the persistence of colonial institutions on present-day outcomes, and one of the most famous papers is by Nunn et al. In 2014, and this is particularly so in countries where the institutions were extractive and not inclusive. Moving on, so I'm involved in some work as well to look at the persistence of access to, or the persistence of missionary schools on present-day Zimbabwean outcomes. So this picture here shows a correlation between distance to missionary school and poverty. So you find that the greater the distance it is to a missionary school, the higher the incidence of poverty. So there's this there's this positive relationship between distance to missionary school and poverty. If you're located closer to a mission school, at the household level, poverty, or at the ward level, poverty might not be as high as farther from the mission school. So, in principle, the end of colonialism dealt with racial inequality. At least that was supposed to be the case. It's not all lost. We've had some tremendous progress. Post-colonialism in Zimbabwe and South Africa, for example, and many other places, we've seen high education enrollment rates more than double. This is the same story when you look at access to, when you look at social indicators and access to public services. There's been a massive improvement. However, instead of us talking about interracial challenges or interracial disparities, we now see these intraracial disparities within group, within a particular race, within the Black race, within the African race. We've seen in many places in Africa, post-colonialism, we've actually seen intra-group operation by new elites. We've seen the entrenchment of new minority political interests, which are often corrupt, and also the engagement in primitive accumulation by wealthy and politically connected individuals using unfair advantages over others to the detriment of everyone else. So the majority of African people, the majority of Black people have remained economically excluded. When we are economically excluded, it more or less follows that, it almost follows that we are also excluded from attaining higher levels of education, including attainment, including enrollment into STEM education and astronomy. Yeah, so there has been progress, as I've said, but the progress has been bumpy. It has not been smooth because the racial inequality, the economic exclusion, it still persists today because wealth is persistent. Once a family has generated enough money, be it in the mines of South Africa, where white families, made a lot of money, with gold or farming or whatever, or even, even slavery. You find that that wealth remains, within the family. So the distribution of income, it take in many years, decades and decades, if not centuries, for these incomes to converge, so that we address these racial inequalities. So we still have Black people working on farms, earning starvation wages, which are hardly enough to ensure that they can send their children to good schools. So that also affects the levels of educational attainment within the African or within the Black population. We also have got cultural factors, whereby due to high fertility, for example, a larger household sizes means that the head of household can only invest so much in each child. Whereas when you look at Western families in general, they've got smaller household sizes, which means they can invest more in on each child, which then means that they are able to recruit more and more, substantially more students into good quality, into higher education than their African counterparts. So I also see this persistence of post-colonial policies, as I've been saying, or I'll add further information to that, and also this vicious cycle of brain drain, as I'll be explaining in the next slides. So cultural factors, I've already briefly touched on it, but when you look at African land markets, for example, I've already said that they are customary in nature. Yet the mainstream financial products of the financial institutions, they require someone to show title deeds that they own a piece of land before they can advance credit or funding, for example, to finance a farming operation. So because of that, so this is the culture, or this is the sort of the norm, the setup that we African farmers have been inherited from those before them. So because of that, then the extent to which they can be more productive, make more incomes, and invest in quality education, amongst other needs, is limited. So in some African societies, there's a this huge patriarchal sort of status quo. And then so what happens is that they prioritize sending boys to school at the expense of girls, but then you've got these huge opportunity costs, because these girls which are then left behind, which are disadvantaged, actually the potential, they were brilliant kids who could actually make a difference in society, who could actually make a lot of money for themselves and their country. So they are huge opportunity costs as well. So, apart from higher rates of fertility, I've explained already, cultural differences may also affect, or may influence lower rates of capital creation. In many African societies, for example, parents sometimes might, invest, or they might not invest as much in in life savings and life insurance, because the norm or the tradition is that as you grow older, your children will be able to look after you. So that could be another issue as well, that affects the rates of capital creation, which affect the levels of incomes, and also the extent to which we can invest in good quality education for our children here in Africa. So the presence of colonial legislation, Black people are still vulnerable to, urban cleanup operations, which disturbs, or, which gets in the way of them, trying to make a living, and ensure that they are leading stable lives, and ensure that they've got stable income so that they can send their children to school. So this is mainly a result of, the legacy of colonial municipal bylaws, where you find that some colonial bylaws which were enacted by colonial administrations to prevent the massing of black people in urban areas are now still being used again, by fellow, against fellow, black people, to ensure that cities are cleaner and and amongst other reasons. Yet the intention for the creation of these laws was just not to make the cities cleaner, but to prevent the massing of of black people in urban areas, to ensure that they do not become influential and sort of turn things around and determine and self-determine their destinies, become independent states. Related to that, you find another, legacy of colonialism is that in Zimbabwe, for example, you had these Group A schools, which were elite schools only for white people, and we had these B schools, which are offering mainly practical and vocational subjects. So, whereas at law, this is no longer, recognized. You still find that in the minds of, of many, people in society. Also, even in terms of accessing these schools, some of them are still, quite expensive. These former A schools, which offer better education, which have got better pass rates, which offer sophisticated experience, which have the capability to to carry out these sophisticated experience, science subject, mathematics subject, whereas the former Group B schools, which are not as privileged, might not be able to churn out students who actually go out and venture into into higher and better careers in STEM, astronomy, and many other disciplines. So in terms of institutional factors, you find that in many African countries there's an abundance of natural resources, minerals, water resources, farm produce, many other resources, timber, etc. But you find that sometimes there is instability, maybe there is armed conflict, sometimes there is too much corruption, lack of transparency, and these resources are overseen by corrupt elites. So at the end of the day, communities do not benefit from their resources to the full extent possible, to the full extent that they're actually able to invest in the education, health, and well-being of their children, so that we can churn out more astronomers, we can churn out more professionals, in economics, other disciplines, into STEM subjects as well. And due to brain drain, universities' ability to attract funding is affected. Human capital development is hamstrung because of what many brilliant African scholars who are not in Africa, who are elsewhere, trying, they're attracted by, by better returns, obviously, they, but then that has got the effect of hamstringing the human capital development on the continent. Universities don't have sufficient capacity, for example, to attract funding to motivate, top, proposals that, that actually qualify and are awarded, top funding opportunities. So this perpetuates, at the end of the day, this inferiority perception towards Africa, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. So what should we do about it? It's not my intention to depress anyone, to make anyone sullen or gloomy, not to be happy. I think there are a lot of things to be happy about, and a lot of things that we can possibly do to ensure that we address some of these racial inequalities or the economic exclusion of Black people. So one thing would be to consider backgrounds and culture. I already gave the examples of maybe financial products, maybe they should be suited more to African status quo, traditional farming and things like that. Peer review in project proposals is also quite important, because sometimes you find that someone from Africa is motivating a proposal, but it's not in their language. Maybe this at the research level, at venture capital level. So maybe what's important is to ensure that the proposals from the same geographical language and cultural context are able to just sort of peer review each other's proposals, instead of having someone who is coming externally, who might think that their supposed lack of comprehension or articulation in a foreign language is a sign that they are incompetent. We might also, try to consider co-designing. For example, the Office of Astronomy's approach, whereby Office of Astronomy for Development's approach, whereby in stage 2 of the proposals, the office actually gives input on all the proposals, which would have gone through stage 1, tapping into the diverse human capacity within the OAD. We should maybe try and empower for sustainability. So that's just the proverbial, teaching how to fish. Because we have massive potential in Africa. Why do I say that? I'll just leave this picture. I'm not an astronomer. I'm not too sure what this is. I don't know what sort of celestial body is. It a supernova? I don't know what this is. Is it a black hole? I don't know what this is. But I know that this image was taken or was made in Africa, I think at the Meerkat Observatory, here in South Africa. So I think this is something that, we should be proud of. That shows that, yes, we can make the change here in Africa. So allow me to say thank you very much for attending this talk. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.